All right, so now we have, all right, so we've put together all the dependencies to use Hilt, right? The dependency injection tool that we're going to be using. Everything is set up, and now it's time for us to look at a room database. So the reason why we were setting everything up is so that it'll be easier for us to set up room database. Now, keep in mind, as I said earlier, keep in mind that dependency injection is a huge topic in Android development and in development in general. And so if you are not grasping these ideas right away, again, don't worry. It may take a little while for you to really understand everything, right? But also remember, you don't have to understand everything when it comes to dependency injection, but you have to understand the advantages that we get from using dependency injection, especially using a library such as Dagger and Hilt as we've been setting it up. Okay, that is the most important thing I want you to take away. It's not about understanding exactly what install in means, but at least understanding how to put together the infrastructure, because this is the way you should always look at building your Android applications. Again, remember, room database is just a layer, an abstraction layer as they call it, which means we are abstracting out all of the work that needs to be done, all of the classes and the objects that needed to be created and used in order for us to create database in the old days, I would call it, quote unquote, right? Old days. So like with anything in development, there are many ways to do one thing, but there's always a better way of doing things. So when it comes to databases, we have a plethora of architecture that we can use to kind of guide us or give us a map how we conceptualize the database in our applications. So I'm going to show you this diagram here, which I got from Android developer site. So there's lots going on in this diagram, and at first you will look at this and feel very overwhelmed and confused and so forth, or you can look at this and understand at least parts of it. But the idea here is we have this architecture that will help us deal with databases, because databases can be very complicated, large, and complex as our applications grow. So again, having a structure, right, an architecture that helps us conceptualize these ideas, put together these pieces, it will really help us as the application grows in complexity. So if you look at this diagram, you see that we have this entity at the bottom, which is room database. So room database, what it does is encapsulates the SQLite, so where the data actually is going to be stored, and it has all the complications, the classes and everything that we don't even need to go into, right? And also encloses the entities. Entities here are just tables of our database, right? So we can say I can create a database and then I have person table, I have a department table, and so forth, right? But now we need to think of a structure that will allow us to communicate with SQLite, which connects to entities, which has our database, which means it has all of the tables and so forth. We need a way to connect to all of this underlying system here, or architecture, right? All of this, remember, is inside of a room database. That's what it encapsulates. We need to be able to access that information so that the application, so if we go upwards in our diagram here, the last thing we have at the top, the green, is the actual application, the UI controller. It says activity fragment, but in this case, could be anything, right? Could be composable and so forth. So internally, you see here, we have this DAO. DAO stands for Data Access Object. As the name implies, is the object that all it does is responsible for directly accessing our database. Okay, so that is what connects to the outer world, to the outside world, if you will. So this layer here, our room database layer, it's where the management of a local database is created and is set up. So we are creating objects that can connect to our database and then expose that information to, in this case, we have a repository, and then we have a view model, which we've talked about, which holds all of the data needed for the UI, right? So this is the one place where all the data is. Now, repository here is seen as the single source of truth for all app data, right? And all that stuff. The repository is optional, right? Because repository, as the name implies, this is where we can put all of the data. So the data comes from through our DAO, right? Because it connects to our database and everything. And then we put everything into our repository. And then repository is the intermediary between the lower part of this diagram, which is the room database, the DAOs and SQLites entities, and all that, and the view model, and of course the user interface at the top. So in the view model, as we've seen, this is where we can use live data, right? Which we haven't talked about, but live data, it's just like immutable state or flow or anything that can observe the state of our data. So if state changes, right, then it's going to notify our user interface that the state has changed. So do what you need to do, which in this case would be to recompose or update the user interface. This is how we would structure our entire room database. So that way we have a base structure we can always follow and have these pieces that work together. Now, the question is always, especially as a beginner, you could always ask, why go through all of this work if we could easily just go and get the data directly from DAO and to go straight to your controller, so mix and match and everything? Yes, it would work, right? But the problem happens when your applications get larger, right? And now you have problems because everything is mismatched, the state is being lost, you don't know where the view model is, or you don't have that, and it just creates a lot of trouble. And we always want to start out by following certain structure, right? A structure that is proven to work, and get used to that structure. Yes, it requires a little bit more of setting things up. It requires a little bit of understanding the pieces, but overall, this is how we need to get used to thinking. That way, we don't run into a lot of issues later as our applications get complex. And of course, it gives us a lot of flexibility because then we can extend each part of the structure. We can modify one part and not affect the other because everything is separated. Everything is decoupled as much as possible. So these are good practices we should always follow in structuring our room database.